なあ、続けてみないか？
人手不足で手伝っただけだから。
じゃあ俺のことを個人的に応援に来ない？
彼女いるでしょ。
昨日は大学生に誘われたってよ。
大変だな。
着替えるからごめん。ランチ今日も持ってきたから。
おー、やった。
よっしゃ。
ありゃ俺に惚れてるな。
ねえ、
ないことはないだろう。可能性は無限大だって。
Hello everybody and welcome to this video looking at Catherine Full Body. This is a HD remaster of the original which was released on PlayStation 3, but the development team has done a lot more than simply upgrade the graphics. They've gone and added a new character called Rin to the story, and Rin's got a whole series of new cutscenes and narrative elements, and Rin is very integrated into the game, so that playing through it for the first time as I have, it was actually one of my blind spots. I'd never played the original Catherine. Playing through it for the first time and Rin's role in the story feels very integral, and I don't know if the game would work to the same extent if Rin wasn't there. But I'm not really here to talk about the game itself. I've got a review coming up on digitallydownloaded.net to talk about it in more detail. What I wanted to do was look at one particular element of Catherine Full Body, which I haven't really seen so many people talk about in the context of the game. There's a lot of discussion that gets thrown out there with regards to the way that Catherine handles relationships and sexuality and all that kind of stuff. Those are kind of the obvious themes. But what I wanted to talk about was something which is perhaps a little bit less of an overt theme through the game. And it's one that really stood out to me as I was playing for the first time. Like I said, I hadn't played the original Catherine. This is something that really stood out to me as being particularly interesting, fascinating kind of addition to the game. So the theme that I really wanted to talk about in this video is the use of Christian imagery throughout Catherine, because there's a lot of it, and it's fascinating because in Japan Christianity never really got much steam. There's a couple of churches in Japan, there's some ministers and there's missionaries and so on, so there is some Christianity there. But unlike in most of the rest of the world, the churches never got much of a prominence. The communities weren't really built around those missionaries doing their work, and the church was not able to get the foothold in the country that it did even throughout mainland Asia. So if you look at the statistics, I think about 1% of the population today in Japan is Christian, and the churches are not really visible. Most Japanese people wouldn't have even been to one, or if they had been to one, they really don't know too much about the religion. So as I was playing this, I was very mindful that the development team probably is not too familiar with Christianity themselves. They're probably aware of it, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do this game, and the imagery that they use is pretty spot on. But it would have been something that they researched, in the way that perhaps if a Western development studio was to make a game about Shinto, they would have to go out and actually research it. It wouldn't be something that's kind of inherent to them, something that they naturally understood or could naturally tap into when they were developing the game. So there's probably some Christians on the development team, I guess. There's at least maybe one or two. But the overall team would have really had to have approached this as a research project, almost like it was a mythology to implement into their game, almost like they were doing a God of War style thing with Greek mythology or Norse mythology. I can imagine that the Japanese team working on Catherine would have approached their research into the religion that they used in much the same way. So you're probably wondering the relevance of that. It comes down to the way that the game really engages with its core themes, which are around sexuality, the relationship between men and women, and commitment and fidelity and all those kinds of things, which are topics that Christianity has some pretty strong opinions of. But when you think about that, the opinions that Christianity has on those topics is a little bit removed to the way that the Japanese look at those topics, and then the Japanese are looking at Christianity as almost like a mythology, not something they necessarily believe in, and certainly not something that their culture has kind of wrapped around and has that cultural belief in. You look at it more of I guess as this game is kind of an essay on the analysis of the way that Christianity looks at these particular topics, and that's fascinating because what we are seeing is the way that the Japanese interpret our understanding as Westerners of these themes. And that's really fascinating because that's definitely not something that we get a look at too often. It's not too often that the Japanese developers or artists in general will take Christianity as a theme and then try and pull it apart and present a story around it. It's also telling that in the game most of the use of the Christian imagery happens in the dream world. The dream world being that nightmare space where you need to keep climbing up blocks in order to avoid some great evil that is chasing after you. And in that place, all the people, all the characters are all men for one thing, and they all look like lambs. So that immediately brings to mind the whole lambs to the slaughter quote, which is so famous from the Bible. And on top of that, these are lambs to the slaughter that are there precisely because they are not faithful to their relationships. That's how you end up in this nightmare world, is because you are not you're not faithful to your spouse or partner. And that's how Vincent, the main character, ends up there as well. He's certainly not a faithful type. So he's got to climb up through these nightmare places specifically because of his immorality in his relationship with one of the Catherines, the Catherine that he was meant to marry, the one he's meant to be in love with. And on top of that, inside that nightmare world, the top of each stage, which you get a moment's break before you move to the next stage, is a confessional. In that confessional, you're always asked a question, and those questions are usually quite simple. They're yes or no, not yes or no, they're binary answers. So and they can be quite silly. Like, for example, one is if you see a particularly attractive ghost, will you have a sexual relationship with that ghost? And you can answer yes or no, and then the game actually tells you where you stand compared to all the other players at the time. So a little graph pops up to show you how your answer marries up with the way that everybody else is thinking. So again, it's those small little questions, and in the context of being a confessional booth, it takes on a very Christian element. Perhaps the most amusing use of Christianity in this space is one of the items that you get is the Bible. So while you're playing around and trying to escape this nightmare scape, you have the ability to pick up some items, and those items can help you out when you get stuck in a pinch. And one of those items is the Bible. And the Bible is an item that you can throw at the other people that are in the stage to get them out of your way. It's actually a very powerful item, and a very destructive one, and a very violent one, which is not how we necessarily see the Bible in the West. And I'm sure the developers weren't trying to push too hard with what they were saying about that, but it is amusing nonetheless to think about that. This is certainly an interesting take on the Bible and the morality of using the Bible in these kinds of situations. As you can see, just as a moment's diversion, I'm not particularly good at this game. I do enjoy it a great deal. I've actually had a great time with it, but I did struggle with it quite a bit at times. The puzzle design I found difficult to wrap my head around. It's not the way, it's not the kind of puzzles that I usually do particularly well at. I'm not good with block puzzles and spatial puzzles and stuff like that, but it's very playable, and again, you can head over to digitallydownloaded.net to read my full thoughts on how the game plays as somebody who hadn't played the original Catherine. But to get back to the point, again, in this kind of nightmare world, it's all very heavily loaded with Christian morality and Christian themes. And the other interesting thing about the game is that those themes are really only present in the nightmare world. When you get back to the real world, the Christian elements aren't there. There's no symbolism, there's no crosses, there's no Bibles, there's no confessionals. All of the stuff that you see, there's no people that are shaped like sheep. All of that stuff isn't really present, just like it isn't in the real Japanese society. This is all something that's kind of in the head of the main character. And that's interesting to think about as well, because it kind of implies that, as far as the developers are concerned, all of this is a little bit removed from reality. So when you think about Christian morality and the real world, what the developers seem to be suggesting is that the real world is a little bit removed from this. This is all stuff that's nice to think about, but when you get into reality, when you get into the implications of what the Bible or what religion says, when you get into those implications, they don't necessarily take into account what the real world's like and the complexities that people need to deal with in their day-to-day lives. And all of that makes sense when you consider that, again, to the Japanese, Christianity is a series of stories. Those stories have a strong moral core to them, and the Japanese recognize that, of course, but they're not stories that have that religious resonance that they do for most of the rest of the world. So again, it's interesting to see how those stories can be repackaged and then reinterpreted into, I guess, a Japanese context. Because again, this game's not a religious game, but it definitely makes very heavy use of Christianity to tell its story and to center its own morality. You're not necessarily meant to sympathize with Vincent. In fact, I would argue you're not meant to sympathize with him at all. He's a bit of a loser, and he's a bit of an unlikable character, especially with what he does to Catherine, this Catherine, the Catherine that he's meant to marry, Catherine, and how easy he falls into temptation with the other Catherine and Rin as well, and his response to Rin with a plot spoiler which I won't give away. So you're not meant to empathize with Vincent, and he's kind of a sounding board for a lot of, I guess, the ideas that the Japanese developers have about Christianity and the stories and the meaning behind those stories from the Bible and from the religion. So it's quite a complex game, Catherine. It's a very complex series of stories, and like I said at the start of the video, people are very good at looking at how those stories really, at how the game looks at the nature of relationships and the challenges that some people have with those relationships. The game, there's a lot of analysis out there about that, and that is handled with a great deal of complexity. But there's a whole lot of other little stories that are underneath, and there's a lot of imagery in there, and that imagery is really dense, and a lot of really interesting stuff there to unpack as well. So while you're playing it, if you haven't played Catherine before, or if you have and you're giving it a replay, I would encourage you to have a think about all of this Christian imagery that you're seeing and the implications of that in the context of the story, plus the implication of that in the context of the Japanese development environment that this game was created in, because it's really interesting to think about. It's one of the more interesting uses of Christianity that we've seen in a game, simply because it comes from the view of the outsider. Otherwise, it's a very good game. I came away from this very impressed, and I'm glad that I filled that blind spot in, because Catherine is a game that people keep recommending that I play, and it's one for whatever reason I just hadn't had the chance to until now. This is the value of remasters and keeping it alive. Hopefully it sells well enough and all that kind of jazz that the developers can perhaps look at a sequel. Not that you want a direct sequel for this, because the story does really tie itself up quite nicely in the end, and it is a complete package. Adding a sequel would seem like overkill, but there's certainly more examples of unfaithful people out there that the developers can tap into, and certainly more stories that they can tell around this idea of fidelity and relationships and tension between different temptations within the relationship, and the fear of commitment and modern life and its impact on people's relationships and all of that kind of stuff. All the stuff that Catherine deals with, you could do that with another set of characters, call it a sequel, and it could be every bit as interesting as the first time around. So fingers crossed. Anyway, that's it for this video. Please do read the review as the complement to the video. Otherwise, please back me on Patreon if you enjoy my videos, my standard beg for money. It's always nice to have that support. So thank you for everybody who does back me on Patreon, and we will see you at the next video.